So my first question, as Jana described, in contrast to the kind of thinking that happens in a jury or through writing, thinking together with art has no presupposed form or outcome. Art as a practice affords us this space and this possibility to experiment with new forms and create new forms and meanings, ideally without constraint. And in this way, thinking together with or in art serves as a kind of epitome of thinking together, because you literally have to create something out of nothing and develop your own ideas about the meaning and the purpose of the work. And in contrast to other forms of thinking together, art valorizes both thinking and feeling, affording this space for the kind of rational and the irrational, a space in which thinking together can embrace and draw from the emotional, sensorial, and poetic texture of our lived experience. And the openness of the meaning and purpose of art as a practice took this extreme form for the creation of Stranger Love, because you were creating an opera with no promise that it would ever be performed. And in preparation for the conversation, you shared all of this material with us that showed us what this open-ended conversation looked like. And I'm just going to share one of the slides to give people a sense of what that conversation over years and years and years looked like. This is just an excerpt of a text exchange between Dylan and Thomas. And my first question is, what was it like to kind of work with someone in this context? What kind of thinking together did it afford for you? What kind of thinking together might it afford more broadly? And in answering this question, I invite you to give us a sense too of the origin of the piece and your friendship with Dylan. How did the project emerge as something collaborative? Where did it come from? So I'll stop the sharing there and pass it to you.
Thanks so much, Gabriella. It's great to see that that's one of 400 million text messages over the course of the 10 years. And I'll respond. I just wanted to say that the singers there, Molly Netter was the soprano, and Isaiah Robinson was singing. And I wish I could name all of the musicians as well. I should commit them to memory, and I'd like to just play the music for the rest of the time, but the invitation is to talk, so I'll do that. And I thought I will respond directly to your question, but I thought it might be helpful for me to give just a bit of framing, particularly in regard to the art of thinking together and the term thinking. With the title, as you had pointed out to me, Gabriella, the title has this, or you had noticed the ambiguity or the dual meaning. On the one hand, it's something about the act of making and the thinking together that happens between the creators as you're making it, as you're making a work, in this case, a work of art. But there's also the act, the art of thinking together in the sense of art that creates an occasion for thinking together. And that entails potentially everyone, certainly everyone who shows up for the performance to experience the piece, the audience, the performers together. And I think it's useful to think about both of those. And I know at first we'll focus on the first of those two, but I do think of Stranger Love very much as a work that endeavors or aspires to achieve the second as well, to create an occasion for thinking together. And I think that I should also say that I'll mostly be speaking from my experience of the work, both making it and listening to it. So I won't be theorizing, but more sort of reporting and reflecting on the experience. But I did want to say something from a bit of a remove about the term thinking, which I think might be helpful. And the way that I'm understanding that term in the context of Jana's project, in the context of this conversation, particularly because thinking might be different from making. And so I think one question for us in talking about these matters is how we coordinate those two terms, thinking and making. So what I'll say is about thinking is not at all comprehensive, but just to give us a bit of frame, for our immediate purposes. And since we're meeting under the sign of Hannah Arendt, I'll make reference to her, particularly The Life of the Mind. I can't resist saying critical edition of The Life of the Mind will be in bookstores soon. April, I think, actually. It's being printed now. So go out and buy it, everyone. I'll be drawing on that work, and I'll just take 2 points that Arendt brings up in the context of her discussion of thinking in The Life of the Mind. One is that she makes a distinction between cognition and thinking. And cognition is, for her, instrumental. It has an end. It's directed toward a purpose. In this context, she talks about the truth as the thing that cognition is oriented toward, cognition or the intellect. And it has concrete results that build on one another. So that's the way that science makes progress, through cognition. Thinking for her is not that. It's not instrumental. It's correlated with meaning rather than truth. It's a manifestation of a human desire for meaning. It doesn't make progress like the sciences. It doesn't stop. It's, in fact, as she presents it, constantly undoing itself. She calls to mind the image of Penelope from Homer's Odyssey, perpetually weaving and unweaving. What it's doing is this act of perpetually weaving and unweaving. So the first thing is that the thinking, as I'm understanding it in our context, is thinking in that second sense, not cognition. And the other thing that comes up in her discussion is, another thing that comes up is a reflection on the relationship between thinking and making. And there's kind of a conundrum there, because if thinking, as she envisions it, is this purposeless, endless, constantly undoing thing, you would think it doesn't make anything. No work of art comes out of it. But at the same time, she calls artworks thought things. That's her term for it. An artwork is a thought thing. And she suggests that there's a close relationship between those two, perhaps also a distinction, but a close relationship. And in that context, and this is the last point from Arendt, she she refers to Heidegger, who also thinks about the relationship between thinking and making. He has in mind the Greek word poiein, which is the same root for the larger sense of making and the specific sense of making a poem. And Heidegger also connects thinking and thanking. So there's a triad: thinking, making, and thanking. Thinking and thanking in German are very close to denken and danken. So putting it all together, thinking, as I'm understanding it, is, in this conversation, is not cognition, it's not instrumental, it's this other, as you said, experimental and open-ended and moving toward meaning in some sense. And then there's this triad: thinking, thanking, making. And I think one of the key questions, and one of the key things in question for us, is how to correlate those three terms. So to answer your specific question about the making of Stranger Love, it was absolutely what you say, that there was no presupposed outcome, that it was a kind of something out of nothing. That was radically true about this piece. No one asked us to do it. We had no idea that anyone would ever want to hear it, that it would ever see the light of day. And it was also, as you suggested, deeply collaborative at every stage. And I think part of the reason why we were able to sustain the work was because it had that thinking together. That, at least in my experience, that was definitely true. And I wanted to bring up thanking because that feels deeply true to me about the experience of making this work. There's a part of the way it came to be is entirely out of our control. It's just good fortune, luck of the draw. Dylan and I happened to meet at a certain time, and these interests coincided. And, without that, there'd be no Stranger Love. And who do you thank? Who do you thank for that? Your lucky stars. But then we were also lucky in having David Bloom to work with, and then down the road, and I think you might have a question about this later, Lileana Blain-Cruz, who directed it. And so there was a lot of luck involved in the first point, and I don't want to underestimate that. But there's also the making, the decisions you make, and the way that the thinking together and making decisions happens. And what I thought I would say in regard to that is crucial to understanding the way that worked for us is the image of a triangle. So there are two people having a conversation, me and Dylan, but there's a third thing, which is the thing that we're making. And somehow always being in relation to that third thing is essential. Anne Carson talks about this in Eros the Bittersweet. It's the third thing that makes the engine go. And that was really true about this. And I say we were making this thing, but it often felt more like discovering. It felt like something that was already there that we were discovering. And because of that, the conversation had a kind of openness and an air and a space, and also a responsibility to this thing that we were discovering. And I should say, I don't have any metaphysical theory about why it feels that way, that we were discovering something rather than making. It's just the way that it felt as we were doing it. And I was thinking one way to capture the image, it's like you're making a puzzle and you're actually making all the pieces. So you're carving all the pieces, but the form is there already. And you're sort of trying to fit the pieces into the puzzle, and you have a sense when it doesn't fit, and you carve the piece a little more and then try to make it fit. But it's not that you begin with a full image and cut it up. So there's somehow paradoxically, you're making the pieces, but you're also discovering how they fit or don't fit. And that was really true about the way that we were thinking together in these endless emails and text messages and exchanges. It was finding how these pieces fit. Dylan would discover something musically, or I discover something in the words, and we'd sort of exchange them. And then we would know when it fit. It would be really apparent. And so the conversation went back and forth in that way. And you had asked about the origin of it. Maybe this is the last thing I'll say and then return it to you, which is there's a way in a project like this that you're preparing for it your whole life. And Dylan speaks really movingly about this as well. But I'll just point to two kind of origin points. One is sort of a prehistory. In 2010, there was a concert that Contemporaneous gave, which is the band that Dylan and David Bloom co-founded. And it was right around the time that they co-founded it. And I attended this concert, and it was a performance of Arvo Pärt's Spiegel im Spiegel. And it was arranged for piano and cello. And David was playing the piano, and Dylan was playing the cello. And I was really moved by this image of a conversation, and particularly about how the conversation was happening on multiple levels. So obviously it was the voice of the cello and the voice of the piano in conversation, but it was also these two artists, these two young artists, just getting to know one another. 14 years later, they'd be in LA performing Stranger Love, but this was the very beginning. So it was a conversation between Dylan and David. And then it was a conversation between Dylan and David and Arvo Pärt. And then it was a conversation between the three of them and the audience. And that conversational mode was really, really interesting to me. And I think informed in ways that I don't fully understand the work on this piece. And then the second sort of origin point was another concert a couple of years later. And this was really when an idea for Stranger Love first kind of came into being. And that was a concert. I recall leaving that concert and having in mind, or having what seemed like a musical idea or a structure or a form. It entailed, as you described earlier, these four voices, ultimately five, four movements, and a fifth, a second spring. So four movements that corresponded with the seasons, beginning with an encounter in the spring and ending with a second spring. And this whole sort of picture or form, there was no story, there was just a form, was in my mind as I was coming out of this concert. And the next time I saw Dylan, I told him about it, and he said immediately, great, I've been wanting to write vocal music. Why don't you write some words and I'll write some music and we'll see where it goes. And happily it's still going, but this is where we got to. So there's a bit long answer to your good question.
No, but really fascinating. And I think the kind of the triangulation of you and Dylan and the piece, and also these kind of ideas of thinking, thanking, and making is really interesting. And I mean, this is kind of connected to my second question, but and you did speak to this earlier in earlier conversations of, did you ever encounter any moments of friction or of not being on the same page with Dylan? And I'm curious about, is there anything that did interrupt that kind of, or what do you think facilitated this mode of collaboration? And do you think that it might have been connected with the sort of the kind of space that art as an idea opens up, right? We tend to think about artistic creation in these kind of existential or spiritual terms. That thinking together in art has a kind of existential or spiritual valences. And it's clear that that was central to the project itself. Do you think that that was also a part of what facilitated a certain kind of collaboration, both between the two of you and also with everyone who came to take part in the project?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And there are a lot of ways of answering it. One is nothing ever got in the way. And nothing ever stopped it. There was no moment where, except for the fact that it might never be realized, but in the creating of it, nothing got in the way. But there were one way to think about what would happen if there were sort of moments of variance was, I think that, and I hadn't really thought this through, but I think that the first thing is that the conversation was virtually unrestrained. We were constantly talking to one another, all channels open 24/7. So there was a shared document that we had that ended up being about 100 pages or something that we were writing in, or text messages or phone calls and emails, just a constant conversation, and really an unrestrained sense of what we could say to one another. But also, I think there were, any time that something seemed odd to one of us, I mean, I shouldn't speak for Dylan, but the move was, my sense of it for him, and certainly true for me, the move was always to expand. If there was something musical that I didn't know how it fit, Dylan would send music to me and I'd hear it and I didn't know how it fit, which usually wasn't the case. Usually it felt like, yes, it's what I've been waiting to hear all my life. But if there was something like that, the move was to reimagine the world and imagine the world in which that fit. So it always felt like it was me realizing, oh, there's a bigger world in which that piece also fits, and I need to see that. An example in the other direction is there's this story, this kind of sub-theme about pilot John Gillespie McGee Jr., who writes this compelling poem, dies very young. And there was a moment when I remember when I was telling Dylan about this story coming in, and he immediately I could sense that the world was opening up for him. And it turns out that he knows the poem or knew the poem already. And I think he might have had his family has some relationship to, like, he's a distant cousin or something. That might be apocryphal, but immediately the world shifted to fit this new piece. So I think that was very often the case with the way it was sort of like, it would never be like this. It would always be like this, And then working with other people, and there's so much to say about that, but I'll say simply that here again, good fortune was on our side when we started work. There was a real question. This, I think, is a question for Jana's project in general, which is, if you have a successful way of working with someone, and it makes sense to talk about it in some sense as thinking together, how do you bring other people into that conversation, particularly when it's as intensive and as productive as our conversation was. And I think part of it, again, was luck in that when we started talking with David Bloom had been around for a long time, and Dylan and David had a very long, rich collaboration. But when Lileana stepped into the picture, she somehow immediately was in tune. It felt really like she had been there all along. She was saying things that felt like it was completing sentences that we had started 5 years ago. But there was something about learning, for us, learning how to, on the one hand, open the circles so that she could enter, and also to realize that now there are 3 of us creating this thing. And then learning, also in learning through her, because she's so good at this, how to then bring in the choreographer and the set designer and the costume designer. And it meant finding ways to talk about what we were doing. Of course, the music always comes first, and it does 90% of the work. But there's also attending to what needs to be said so that someone else can hear what you're up to.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I really like this idea of the need, like when there is a moment of conflict or a moment of friction of some sort, that the answer is actually finding a new form. And it's not necessarily the only form that's possible is not necessarily the ever expanding circle, but it's some maybe new configuration of boundaries and literally structures, forms that allows that new element to exist, or allows those frictions can become to become productive. And I mean, to me, it's that there's a clear like political sort of dimension to that as well, in how to think about the political quality of making art, and also the political, it reminds me of our last question. I'm also paying attention to time. I think I'll end on this question and allow this question to open out and create a new form with new questions coming in to texture the shape of this conversation. And the last question is kind of about how we think about the relationship between politics and art making, and the specifically political dimension of this project. One thing that is so striking is the dedication you maintain to it over such a long period of time. And I did want to bring in, you described the durational quality of the piece. Remember, it's 6 hours, right? As political, to the extent that it strengthens our capacity for kind of long-term thinking and imagining. That's necessary to understand political matters. And I wanted to bring in a quote that you wrote in one of the notes on your piece, where you say, "The piece nurtures the capacity for the kind of sustained reflection and long-term thinking to grapple with political questions. It does so not only thanks to its epic scale, but relatedly because of the long narrative, poetic, and musical arcs. The way that developments at one point have ramifications later and much later in the piece. The way that subsequent developments recall and then advance earlier moments. All of this both demands and rewards sustained attention. And the beauty of the world seduces the audience into granting such attention." And I will leave you, a couple of minutes to respond to that, and then we can open out. How did the time scale shape the kind of thinking you were able to do together? And could you speak at all about how you think about the political valence or nature of this project?
Yeah, I'll respond in a way echoing some of the things that you said, which really captures a lot of it. At least in this, I want to be brief because I'm happy to hear questions from others. Maybe I'll say just 3 things very briefly. One is that, as you said, there's something about our commitment to making the fact that it was important enough for us to sustain this energy and to pour this much of our lives into it, that is matched and met by an audience who agrees to be there for 6 hours, to take 6 hours out of their lives to, or longer actually, there's dinner in between, to participate. And so there's something about them, the audience honoring us and us honoring the audience, but also all of us committing to do this thing together. And Dylan had this idea that we should have "I Survived Stranger Love" t-shirts that we would give out at the end. But there was the underlying idea was that it was a little community, in a sense, that we created for a short period of time. It's maybe too much for me to say anything about the way in which that quote about the way in which this kind of demanding and rewarding sustained attention develops habits of thought or strengthens a capacity to think long term. I think that's really important, but I'll reserve further comment on that. The last thing I'll say, though, is that it's also really important that it's beautiful. I mean, at least we think it is. And it's deeply pleasurable to be in that. It's a space you want to be in. And to borrow a term from Hannah Arendt, again, her amor mundi, love of the world, is a key term for, in Arendt's political thinking, one must love the world. And I think part of the impulse, although we never talked about it exactly in these ways, is the world is lovable in part because things like this can come to be in it. And there's an imperative to create beautiful things so that we can love the world in that sense. So let's open the doors.
I was just going to say that was absolutely magnificent, and listening in the background, as I was going to say rarely do or never do when I'm hosting or convening the series, and occasionally do for our events. I was reflecting on so many things, but most importantly, or perhaps most prominently, reflecting on how different this is from how a lot of people have come to think about thinking together as something that is ego-fronted, individualistic, or only collective to a degree to which it allows some kind of fulfillment of a personal projection or personal ambition. So in that sense, it was in addition to a lot of other things, deeply emotionally moving. I obviously enjoyed listening to the music, and I would have, much like Thomas and possibly like a lot of our audience, preferred to have more of that. So just so that everyone who's joining us knows, I am currently I guess advocating for the European tour of Stranger Love, but also we all hope that there are going to be more performances in the US. So hopefully there will be a chance for all of you to hear more than just an excerpt or just the material that's available on YouTube, which is also something to begin with. On that note, I thought we do in fact have some questions. So I thought we could move on to those because they're very interesting and they do pick up on quite a few things that have been said. So the first one refers back to the political quality of making art, and Suming asks or says the political quality of making art is about process and uncategorized action, but politics is more often about categories of forms. How do these two things work together or not? Or we could add, if Suming will forgive me for adding to the question, how do these two forms think together or not? I mean, obviously, this is a question for both of you, so feel free to answer in any order you would like.
Gabriella, you would like to start?
I'll pass that to you to start, Thomas.
Okay, yeah, I'll say a couple of things. It's a very good question, for which I'm grateful. One way of thinking about the way in which this piece is not, but this piece specifically, I mean, it's a broader question about art in general. There are many ways in which this piece is not political. It doesn't tell you who to vote for. It doesn't tell you what policies to support. There are a lot of things. It doesn't categorize liberal or conservative, and there's a whole lot of things a lot of ways in which it isn't political, and in which some other kind of art. I'm teaching Brecht right now, which is political in a different way, that I think is entirely valid and significant. This work isn't political in that sense, but it is in. And one thing I would say in response to the question is that there's space and need and desire for that kind of art as well, I think. It's different from this, the way in which this is political. There's various ways of thinking about it, but one is, as Gabriella, as you were saying, this creating a community in which, and a space in which long-term, the stop and think that Arendt talks about is encouraged. It's a moment to take a break from constant response, constant reply, and it invites you to slow down and to dwell in a space with people and with this music for a long time. And I think that simply encouraging a slowing down and a kind of stop and think is in itself a political necessity. I think that the rapidity with which public discourse happens now is detrimental to politics in all sorts of ways. And so that's one aspect of it. And also, as you were saying, Gabriella, the way that it demands long-term thinking, and to see, to think in structures that expand is also important for, we don't do that much. There's not a lot of opportunity to really be in a space where you're thinking about the broad expanse, and this opens up, and there's a way in which you can only experience it by hearing the music, but that I think that it does something different from the kind of work that identifies categories and defends positions, which also has an incredible value.
I would just add a little something, which is that I mean, I think forms are political, right? All forms are not necessarily political, but we have even the form of the workday, right? That's a form. But when I was thinking specifically about what you were talking about, I'm reminded of something that appears on the poster for the piece, which is about there's this moment of description of the start of disco music, where I think Chris Kleymeier, I think, was the person who did this.
Chris Kalmeyer, Chris Kalmeyer is the artist who created that poster that you saw earlier.
Yeah, and this poster, I think I will share it actually really quickly, but the poster has this moment of the description of the creation of disco music, where Donna Summers was the first to produce a song of 17 minutes. And the question was, why at that point the form of a dance song was 3.5 minutes. And the start of disco was like, well, but wait, that's what is that form of a song? That 3.5 minutes is for consuming and producing a song. What if we make a song that's for dancing, right? And imagining these different kinds of forms, aesthetic forms, that then invite different kinds of modes of political being, right? Where time is not necessarily for working, time is for dancing. There's a song of 17 minutes. So I think that that's another way of thinking about kind of the relationship between politics and form. Yeah, no, just as you take the next question or respond, I'm just going to share the poster.
I was going to say that's a great idea. Thank you. And I was just going to add, I mean, there's another really interesting element of thinking about the relationship between time and production, and that does come through Hannah Arendt, who's also the proper subject. I'll just pause for a moment so everyone can appreciate the poster, including the element of time that just make such good use of Donna Summers. But I think there is, you know, something to be. That is the size of the poster, yes.
Yeah, I just to give a sense of scale.
Indeed. I think there's something really, really interesting to be said about the relationship between creation and time, because one of the things that Hannah Arendt liked sort of focusing on or operationalizing in her work is the relationship between eternity and immortality and kind of normal human time of the polis, whereas immortality was obviously achieved through deeds, and deeds are not, in her framing, narrowly production. Sometimes they're achievements that go beyond the creation of something, but they can very much be the creation of something as well. And that was often the realm of politics. This is where human affairs were taking place. But eternity, which in and of itself sits outside of time, is thus opposed to both normal human life, so mortal life, but also opposed to immortality, because immortality just means enduring existence in the minds or histories or lives of men, as Arendt would have framed it, and immortality just means existence outside of the scope of the human, and that's outside of the scope of human time. So I think there is something really beautiful to be said about the relationship between this refusal to even account for time, or to, even, in a manner of speaking, be bound by constraints or requirements of time, obviously to the degree to which we can, as humans after all, and the impetus that it does give to work. We have many more questions that have just begun to come in, as they often.
Can I add just briefly to that? Your comments is, it's related to, Gabriella, what you were talking about before, is, I forget the exact language you used, but the spiritual dimension to the piece, which is runs throughout the whole piece, and that there's something about the way perspective works in this piece, that you move in Act 1 is these two particular people who have stories and names. Act 2, which is a kind of human time. Act 2 is paradigmatic or mythical, and it retells the love story, but in a paradigmatic time. There are three pairs of dancers, and it says something that's maybe true about human love generally, not just specifically these two people. And then Act 3 expands to a love supreme, to quote a great musician. And it's deliberately expanding in that sense, and the way that you have a sense of your perspective is transformed through the piece.
That gives us, in a manner of speaking, maybe impetus for Alice's question, who says, given that Hannah Arendt sits in the background of this conversation, I would say also at the front and on the sides and possibly all over the place, did she work in collaboration with other artists, whether in the production of music or some other artwork that expanded her thinking beyond the academic realm? Thanks. I think it would be really good to perhaps mention Hannah Arendt's poems, but I don't know, Thomas, if you want to take this one, or how shall we go about it?
Well, I can say a couple of things quickly. Well, Hannah Arendt's poems, she did write poetry, and it's about to be published. Our friend Samantha Hill is translating, has translated that. Those will come out. But I think also coincidentally, I was just hearing something from Mary McCarthy noting that how much Arendt loved music, which doesn't, I've looked around in her work for references to music, and there isn't that much. But McCarthy says she really loved music, and particularly Bach. And it also, she was very good friends with a number of great poets, Auden, of course, Randall Jarrell, and others, and writers, novelist Mary McCarthy, one of her best friends for sure. But I don't know that she ever collaborated. I'll be happy to be proved wrong, but I don't know that she collaborated with an artist on, she didn't write catalog essays or write poems with anyone else. The poetry she wrote was definitely not for publication. It was for herself, and it was in journals. So she loved music. She writes about Shakespeare a lot. She liked theater, but I don't know that she ever collaborated with an artist.
I mean, I would probably say, you know, her engagement. I mean, sure, on the production note, although obviously, you know, as I'm sure people who attend this series would have heard before, Hannah Arendt was a great fan of developing thought in conversation and was very dedicated to her intellectual and other friends. I think possibly the sort of conversation, non-conversation with Auden would count as that, although it never took the form of official collaboration. But
I definitely think they thought together in your sense, Jana, for sure.
I'm mindful of time, but we have started a bit after the exact clock. So I'm wondering, there's another question that is pretty long, but I'm wondering whether it just makes sense to perhaps leave it open to address, and that's Denny's question about the version of the description of the event on the Philosopher website, which uses the vision of Octavio Paz and Stranger Love as an opera that celebrates the wild bet of human love, allowing us to glimpse pure vitality in this life. And I think Denny's question basically asks whether the work of thinking together or thinking together through the creation of art involves the same kind of feeling. That's at least how I've understood it. So what would you say?
Gabriella, you want to take a first pass?
I might pass this one to you to start with.
Sure.
I think the easy way to perhaps reduce this question is to ask, must we love people we think together with, or do we start loving people if we start thinking together?
Yeah, so thank you, Denny, for the question. And I think that the key, or at least I hope this responds to it, it's the third thing that matters. It's the other thing. So the thinking together, insofar as thinking together is erotic, which in some sense it is, I think, certainly in Plato's sense, it's always in reference to something that is beyond the two. And that, I think that's what when Paz in that quote talks about pure, the relationship, I mean, he's talking specifically about romantic love, but it has analogies elsewhere. The romantic love permits a glimpse into something else. He says really beautifully, not a different world, or not another world or an afterworld, but pure vitality.